Eric Parfit, in the 1984 book Reasons and Persons, suggests a significant problem with utilitarian theory. It's actually a general problem in value theory and population ethics, but it's particularly applicable to utilitarianism. The argument applied to utilitarianism suggests that utilitarian assumptions lead to conclusions that Parfit calls repugnant, and the repugnance of these implications provides a reason to reject utilitarianism. Let's look at the argument. The way this argument is going to work is like this. We're going to start by assuming that the utilitarian thesis is correct. This is the thesis that the best state of affairs is the one with the most overall utility. Next, we're going to follow what is supposed to be a valid chain of reasoning, adding additional true premises. This will eventually lead us to Parfit's repugnant conclusion. If this conclusion is indeed repugnant, and if the argument is sound in all other respects, this will give us reason to believe that the original assumption that the utilitarian thesis was correct was a mistake. The utilitarian thesis is, in fact, incorrect. So then, let's start with the utilitarian thesis. We will look at it as expressed by the slogan that the best option is the option that produces the greatest amount of overall utility for the greatest number of people. To make our argument, let's begin with a community of 1,000 people. Each person has 100 units of net lifetime utility, adding all of the good times and subtracting out all the bad times. The community as a whole then has 10,000 total units of utility, 100 per person times 1,000 people. Next, we add another group of 1,000 people. Each of these new people will have a life with 89 units of utility. The utilitarian would have to say that this community is better than the previous community. It certainly can't be any worse. It contains the same 1,000 people, each with a life experiencing 100 units of utility that the original world had. All we're doing is taking that original world and adding more people, all of which generally have lives that, while not quite as good as those of the original population, aren't bad. There is, in short, more overall utility being enjoyed by a greater number of people. If the most overall goodness for the largest number is what matters, then this represents a better community. Now we're going to take that population and add a program that'll even out the total amount of utility. And we're going to assume that our program actually creates just a little more overall utility. While the original community had a total of 18,900 units of total utility, we create a more equal world with 19,000 units of utility. The utilitarian would have to agree that program was an improvement to the community as a whole. By stipulation, there is more utility now than there was before. Next, we take that community and we add another 2,000 people. Each of these has a life in which they experience 84 units of net lifetime utility. Just like with the previous time in which we added people, the utilitarian will have to agree that we have improved the world. It's not any worse. All of the people in the original world are experiencing as much utility as they did before. We are merely adding a second population, each of them experiencing a quality of life nearly, though not quite as good as the original population. Again, we introduce our program that results in utility being more evenly distributed. The program creates a little utility in the process, so the overall utility goes from being 35,800 units of utility to 36,000. This is a greater amount of utility for the same number of people, so the program benefits the community as a whole. We repeat the process, adding a population as large as the original with lives that have slightly less utility than those already existing in the world. We will then combine the population and even out the utility, creating a little utility in the process. And we repeat this again and again and again. And we end up with this huge population of people whose lives are barely tolerable. All things considered, the people will say that it's better to have lived than not to have lived, but just barely. There's slightly more joy than misery, but extremely little. The utilitarian is going to have to say that this is the best world of all of the worlds we have considered. If we assume a population of 1 trillion people, each with 1 unit of overall utility, then the overall amount of utility for the population is 1 trillion units. This exceeds all of the utility in any of the other worlds we've considered by a huge margin. In each step along the way, we have, in utilitarian terms, created more overall utility. This makes the world with the vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living the best of all of the worlds that we have considered in this argument. And this is the repugnant conclusion that Parfit has warned us about. 1 trillion people, each with 1 unit of net lifetime utility, produces a total of 1 trillion net lifetime units of utility. On the utilitarian standard, this is 10 times better than a world with 1 billion people, each experiencing 100 units of utility. The fact that we have reached this repugnant conclusion gives us reason to doubt the original assumption. It is not the case that the world with more overall utility is better than the world with less overall utility. It is not the case that 1 trillion people, each with 1 net unit of utility, adding all of the happiness and subtracting all of the unhappiness, is better than a world with 1 billion people, each enjoying 100 net lifetime units of utility, even though the latter has only 1/10 as much total utility as the former. Perhaps we need to alter the utilitarian assumption. Let's look at an option that says that it's the average net lifetime utility that matters, not the total. Under this version, the world with 1 billion people having 100 units of net lifetime utility is better than the world with 1 trillion people with 1 net lifetime utility, because the average is higher in the first case. However, let's apply this to a world with a more realistic distribution of lifetime units of utility. We can imagine a world in which the distribution of lifetime utility is distributed along a bell curve. Some people have a life where the lifetime utility is low, and some have lives where the lifetime utility is very high. But the bulk of the people have something in the middle. If we have this distribution along a bell curve, well, one way to increase average utility would be by simply eliminating those at the bottom. We can continue to eliminate people whose quality of life is below average as long as their elimination didn't reduce the happiness of those who remain. Those who perform essential services, such as holding down low-paying jobs, would remain, but those who contribute little or nothing to the quality of life of others and whose own quality of life is below average can be eliminated without reducing the average. In fact, eliminating them will increase the average, and if average is what matters, then this is what should be done. Now, this isn't the same repugnant conclusion as we had before, but it does seem just as repugnant. Let's try another alternative. One of the assumptions made in the original case is that value consists in discrete individual units that can be added together. 1 unit of utility plus 1 unit of utility makes 2 units of utility. In the series on objective value, I discussed the option that value is a relational property rather than an intrinsic property. On that account, all value exists as relationships between states of affairs and desires. You can't simply say that one world is better than another on the basis of containing more discrete units of utility. One evaluates worlds by determining whether they are such as to fulfill the desires in question. So if you take your original population of 1,000 people and ask them to consider a policy of adding another 1,000 people whose lives will be not quite as good as theirs, what would they say? Under the assumptions we built into this question, since their overall utility remains the same, they would shrug with indifference. They couldn't care one way or the other. Ask the original population if they want to add 1,000 people and then even out the utility so that everybody has the same amount, and they have no reason to accept that recommendation. Accepting it would be the difference springs from the different ways in which the two conceptions think of value. In the original conception, the conception that led to the repugnant conclusion, it was held that there are intrinsic reasons to bring somebody into existence who would have a good life. Denying them a life that they would enjoy is to fail to realize something of intrinsic value. Here, we're using a conception that says that the value of bringing somebody into the world who would have a good life depends on whether it would fulfill the desires that exist. Desires that will not exist as a result of a decision not to bring somebody into the world results in value that would not exist. The original conception suggests that you have an obligation to have a child if that child would have a good life. This conception makes no such suggestion. However, consider that a community has a choice between two policies. Policy 1 will improve the quality of life of the individuals slightly and bring people into existence who have a fairly high quality of life. Option 2 will improve the quality of life of the individuals even more, but bring people into existence who have only a moderate quality of life. Evaluating policies relative to the desires of those who would adopt them would give the higher value to option 2. In summary, there's a problem with conceiving of value the way that utilitarians conceive of value. That there are reasons to doubt that value exists as discrete packets of reasons-giving entities that there are reasons to make as abundant as possible. Yet the option of relating value to desires leaves open the question of whose desires count. And this remains a serious problem for utilitarian theories.